Welcome back to What's Next with Lacey, the podcast where I interview a variety of young professionals about their career journey so far. This week, I spoke with Lewis. Lewis works in recruitment in the tech/finance space. He has spent the majority of his career in London, but has recently moved to Singapore. It was really interesting to get Lewis's perspective on the field and to understand how hard you have to work to be successful. I've never been hit up by a recruiter because that just doesn't happen in my industry, so I know absolutely nothing about how it all works, but even still, I have come out with a whole new appreciation for the industry. If you are social, resilient, and a hard worker, then this is definitely the field for you. Anyway, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Lewis. Lewis, welcome to What's Next. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
You are calling in from Singapore, which is freaking mental.
Yeah, weird. I think obviously we met each other in London, right? So it's been about 6 months. I'm sure we'll obviously cover quite a lot about the job and why I've moved and everything, but just about adjusting, just about getting used to things. Enjoying it, which is the main thing.
That is the main thing. Good. I'm glad. Well, yes, we will absolutely dig into all of it, and I'm excited to do so. So you work in headhunting/recruiting, and you've done that in various different spaces. I want to start with what exactly headhunting/recruiting means. Is that two separate things? Am I getting it wrong? Do you do one more than the other? What exactly is a space like that? What does a space like that look like?
I don't necessarily think that they're different terms, if that makes sense. I think they come under the same umbrella. From like a professional context, you'll see a lot of people, like look on LinkedIn, for example, loads of people call it talent acquisition as well, especially if they're working in-house for the company. The area that I cover is called vendor recruitment, agency, third-party recruitment. Basically, a company will hire us to go find candidates for them and then pay us a fee if we place that candidate, essentially, rather than just doing it in-house, of having like a in-house recruiter who works for the company, or just posting an ad on LinkedIn, for example, or just having jobs on their careers page.
Yeah. So what spaces have you specifically worked in?
Mostly my career's been technology. Within that, obviously, that's a really broad industry, right? So mostly software engineering, and mostly within financial services. So historically, my previous company and my current company, most of the clients that I will work with and most of the companies I'm trying to find people for essentially are big banks, hedge funds, a lot of the time, private banking and wealth management firms, asset managers.
Like a client will come to you, they'll give you a spec of, I'm assuming, what they were looking for, and then you just find that person?
Yeah, essentially. I think there's it depends client to client because different companies like doing things different ways, right? So if you take like a Goliath like JP Morgan, which have like tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of employees globally, they'll have like a really, really strict process. So you will have to get the job from a very specific HR person who will then release a job to you on a portal that they have, and you've got to upload CVs to that portal. Like, it's a very, very strict,
interesting,
regulated process. If you're working with a startup of 10 people, they don't really care, right? So they don't really have like a portal. They're basically just like, I'll send like CVs over WhatsApp to the hiring manager and just be like, hey, what do you think of this person? Right. And terms and like the legal terms will be 2 pages long. 5 pages long, rather than like a 110-page document. So it could be a lot more fluid. A lot of them don't have job descriptions as well. From a recruitment perspective, it doesn't make sense to pay someone like myself or the company that I work for, 20% of someone's base salary as a fee if it's a pretty easy role to fill. Right. So if it's a role where they can just definitely be able to find someone by posting a job ad on LinkedIn, they're not going to hire me. So a lot of the time, recruitment agencies asked to work roles that aren't officially released to market. A lot of the time, it will be stuff that they've been trying to hire for 6 months, maybe. A lot of the time, it might be a case where it's a very, very senior hire. And that's why companies need to specialize generally. I mean, if you get massive like global recruitment companies that do loads of sectors and industries, but individual recruiters will usually specialize because companies are paying you for your knowledge of the network, knowledge of the market.
Yeah.
Essentially your book of candidates, right? That's in a very, very specific field. So that's what they're paying you a premium for, essentially.
So then how are you finding your candidates? Are you just searching LinkedIn? Do you have some sort of special way of finding people to put up for these jobs?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about recruitment, I guess, like in previous episodes you've done, right? Like you've spoken to lawyers, management consultants, exactly the same with those industries, I imagine. It depends massively on company culture because different companies have different way of doing things. And there is quite a lot of freedom, I think, in recruitment to be able to do things how you want to do them. Like you can get the job done in 1,000 different ways. Some people treat it as a volume business. So they will go onto a job board and call every single person and try and find if they're right. Other people will spend a lot of time on LinkedIn and try and find a very specific person on LinkedIn. Some people will be more referral based because they've got a really big network of people and just call someone they know and go, who do you know that's right for this? Which towards the senior end is kind of what you end up having to do anyway, because a lot of people who are good enough to fill this job aren't always looking, right? The reality is it's kind of a cycle where companies aren't going to pay us a big fee to find someone who's pretty average.
Yeah.
They want the best that they can get, right? If they're going to be paying a premium.
Yeah.
And the best candidates on the market in any field aren't always looking because the best candidates are very good at what they do and get looked after by their current company and are probably paid pretty well. So a lot of the best candidates aren't always going to be on Indeed or Reed or whatever have you, posting their CV there. A lot of them aren't going to be on LinkedIn because they're sick of recruiters pinging them 20 times a day.
Yeah.
It is, right? Yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting. So then how closely do you work with a candidate through the process of them getting hired? I mean, I guess, again, it depends on company to company, but you're not just like submitting this to the company and then being like, well, hope they get picked. Like, are you working with them on like preparing for stuff, or is that truly just you're submitting them and being like, see, maybe?
I say as a general rule of thumb, you take it through the whole process. So I'll talk about it from a company perspective first, and then probably more on an individual level. The services that a recruitment firm will usually offer is that they will find the candidate, manage the candidate's salary expectations, be the point of contact all the way through to offer and contract signed. Now, how that's done on an individual level depends on the company because, for example, at a small recruitment company, you may have to do it all yourself. You may have to go find the candidate, speak to the candidate, make sure the candidate's interested in the role, send the candidate to the client, prepare the candidate for interviews, arrange all the interviews, all the way through to then closing them on the offer and making sure they walk in on day one. And then other recruitment companies, if they're maybe a bit bigger or they operate a bit differently, you'll have different roles within the company. So there's something which a lot of companies do, which is called a researcher, which is generally towards the first couple of years of your career. So it's usually graduates or people who are kind of at least parts of their recruitment journey, career, whatever you want to call it. They are usually responsible for doing the start of the process. So finding the candidate, qualifying their skill set, making sure that they're the right fit for the job, and then they may hand it over to a more senior person in their company who maybe manages the candidate through the later stages of the interviews to talk to them about money, talk to them about competing offers, talk to them about counter offers, maybe the more nuanced and complex parts of the process. And then on the other side, on the client side of things, you may get someone at the company who's the representative and point of contact for the client, as if in the company that's hiring, right? So that may be an account manager, for example. So for example, if I'm hiring for JP Morgan and they're advertising a role for a software engineer, you may get someone in the recruitment company who's the account manager for JP Morgan and is the one talking to HR.
Yeah.
Right. And then maybe it's someone different who's actually managing the candidate who's trying to go there.
Interesting.
Depends on the size of the company, basically.
Yeah. That's so interesting. So then, because it is so flexible and because it's so kind of independent and each way that you can do things different and you can do things differently in so many different ways, is it a very collaborative industry? Are you working with a lot of your colleagues really closely? Is this kind of like, oh no, it's just me handling this specific, job or whatever it might be? How does that work?
my previous company was really, really collaborative because of the way that they set things up. Like there was no way that you couldn't, because there were 15 parts to a process, 15 different people involved. You had to work together.
Yeah.
Whereas in my current company, they're kind of just like, don't really care what you do. You can work completely by yourself.
I mean, it does just seem like such an industry where it can be so different in so many different ways. Why did you make this transfer to Singapore? What drew you to Singapore? What drew you to this company? Was it because it was more flexible in regards to how you do things? Like, why did you make this switch?
There's the personal aspect and then the career aspect. I'll talk about the personal first. So in my previous company, we're based in London. I worked the London market for a while, and then I basically joined onto a desk there that worked the US market, mostly New York. So all my clients, all my candidates that I was speaking to were in New York, but I was mostly based in London. That was done with a view to move out there, and then timelines just didn't align, unfortunately. They weren't going to move out in time, and I wanted to get out of London. My family's from Asia. I always wanted to go live in Asia at some point. From what I do for work, Singapore or Hong Kong always made the most sense. So when I left my job last year in London, I was looking at opportunities in both Hong Kong and Singapore. That kind of leads naturally into the career perspective about why I moved. Singapore's massively growing for tech. The finance aspect is still kind of mostly driven from Hong Kong, but a couple of years ago, in some part due to kind of like the political climate of the time, there was a kind of a big migration from Hong Kong over to Singapore. So part of me is kind of banking on that continuing to happen and finance growing here as well. So that's what made sense from a career perspective. In terms of the company and why I chose, the really honest answer is that there wasn't that much choice in some senses. So there are a lot of recruitment companies here, and I interviewed with a few places. I was quite delivery driven in my previous company. A lot of my job was to find candidates and to speak candidates and get them into jobs. That was, I'd say, maybe 70 to 80% of my job. And then the rest was kind of more account management focused. So speaking to the client, managing things on that side. But what that meant is I didn't need to do that much business development. A lot of the business development was driven from the directors. And as I kind of grew through my career, I did a bit more, and they encouraged us to do a bit more, but it just wasn't up to the level that I needed it to be, basically, for a lot of the companies here, where they look for someone who's maybe a bit more of a 50-50 split. So I was offering something as a candidate, as it were. I was offering quite a specific skill set, which I think maybe 3 or 4 companies in Singapore, which focused on finance and tech and kind of this model of working. There are maybe 3 or 4 that I thought were a suitable fit and hiring. So it's basically a case of getting one of those 3, basically, which actually I did. So yeah, that's how I've ended up here.
Hi guys, it's Lacey. Thank you so much for listening to my conversation with Lewis. If you're enjoying this episode, please share it directly with one friend, family member, colleague, or whoever you think might find this episode interesting. I would really, really appreciate it. Now let's get back to the episode. I now want to get into a bit of the more nitty gritty of your day and your job. So I want to start with your hours. So what were your hours when you were working for the company in London, and what are your hours now?
Before I answer that, I will say that I think recruitment, I haven't been here obviously long enough in Singapore to say about this market, but the attitude has changed, I think, culturally in London as well. I saw that towards my end of the time at the previous company. Just hiring was very difficult because a lot of candidates wanted, as in recruitment candidates, wanted more flexible hours. But when I first started back in 2018, my hours were usually in at about anywhere between 7:30 to 8, finishing anywhere between the first couple of years. The earliest finish was really 7:30. So yeah, usually I think Monday to Thursday would be averaging probably usually a 12-hour day, I'd say. And then Friday is usually a bit easier. No one really works hard from 3, 4 p.m. on a Friday because nobody, hiring managers don't want to be looking at CVs.
Yeah.
Candidates Friday afternoon, HR want to go home as well and everything. Nobody wants to speak to a recruiter at Friday at 4 p.m. Right?
Yeah.
So, and then usually kind of a bit of work on the weekend as well. Nothing kind of too crazy, not 8 hours, but usually log on and do a few hours on the weekends. By the time I left, it was a bit more flexible, I'd say, because I was working on the New York market. I was usually in at about maybe 10 in the morning, I'd say. And then I'd work through till about maybe 8, something like that, give or take, with a bit more flexibility because obviously as I got more senior, I was trusted a bit more that if I need to go home and do a call at 10:30, 11 at night, because that's when someone in New York who's whatever that is, like 3 p.m. or whatever, their time. You've got to do that.
Yeah.
So a bit more flexibility there towards the end. In my current company, official hours, I think 9 to 6, but my boss is really flexible, thankfulully, and they are generally across the company. I wouldn't say it's complete flexibility and that can work whenever I want, but I usually try and get to the office anywhere between 9 and 9:45. Usually leave between, I'd say probably 6 and 7 now. So quite a big change.
Big change.
I think the big difference maybe is I don't think necessarily the amount of work I do has gotten a lot less. It's just about the amount of time I need to be in the office or at my desk.
Yeah.
So even here, if I've got to take a call at 9, 10 p.m. for whatever reason, I've still got to be online.
Yeah.
Like the service, like one of the main services that recruiters should offer is availability to either the company or the candidate. Yeah, like I said, I don't think I'm working that much less in terms of hours, but I'm trusted to be able to I need to leave at 5 to go do something for an hour and then trusted to log back on at home. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's flexibility there. It was nice.
That is nice. That is nice, especially with a job like yours, which is going to be coming at you at all different times from all the different people. So then what does a typical day look like for you in terms of meetings and just like work you're doing on your own? Like, are there scheduled meetings or does it kind of look different every day because you're meeting with different clients or different candidates at different points throughout the day?
Yeah, exactly that. The second part that you mentioned. I feel like it's a running theme of this podcast. There's real flexibility in how you want to set up your day. Right? Me personally, I quite like setting my day into like blocks, usually like morning and afternoon, keep it quite easy, right? So morning, I'll usually try and do all my internal stuff, internal meetings, stand-ups, going to different team members if I need something from them, sort all my admin for the day. And then usually in the afternoon, I will do most of my external stuff, as it were. So go meeting candidates, meeting clients. Sometimes that's over a VC. In Singapore, a lot, it's actually in person because it's such a small place. Everything's like a kind of 10-minute walking distance. So people are a lot happier to meet in person. So I do that a fair amount. A lot of that is from a delivery perspective. I might be messaging candidates on LinkedIn and trying to find and be in like a search or a project to go find the right candidate for a role. I'll have scheduled calls that I need to take. From a business development perspective, it's just keeping on top of my pipeline, making sure I'm following up on people, reaching out to people. But yeah, it could be pretty structured. I know some of my colleagues do it a little differently in terms of how they structure their week. One of my colleagues does she leaves Fridays for like just admin. So she basically leaves all her admin till one day. And then she basically just sits headphones in on a Friday and just churns that all out in one go. Yeah. I know some of my colleagues do like a set BD day. So they'll have a couple of days in their week or however much they want to do it, given, how busy they are at the time or whatever, where they'll just dedicate a day to BD and they're not doing basically, unless it's business critical, they're not really doing anything that's delivery related. It's all like focused on business development. So yeah, it is kind of up to you how you structure your day.
So I feel like I've heard before, and correct me if I'm wrong, that is it kind of like being a broker for like an apartment, and that like you have a base salary, and then if you successfully place a client, like you'll get a bonus. Is that how that works? Or is it kind of like pooled in together and then you like all get a bonus, or how does that generally work?
So in my type of recruitment, the former of what you said, there are different types of recruitment as well. There is something called executive search, which is a kind of different side of recruitment, which is more typically looking at C-suite level type hires, right? Stuff that takes, I don't really know because I don't work in that market, but I imagine like months at a time. And they do a lot fewer deals as a company but those fees are huge.
Right.
And usually the way that those guys get paid, from my understanding, is that they will get like, putting something out of on my head, like 30% up front to take on the job. And they're the only company working that role. So they've kind of like won the business as that like sole company doing that. Right. And then it may take months. It's a lot more of a research driven job, from my understanding. So a lot more about mapping out the market, a lot more about mapping out like the right personality fits, because the stakes are so much higher with that person being hired, like the C-suite level. I think the stakes are just a lot higher. So the fees are a lot bigger, takes a lot more time.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, it's got to be a lot more covert, I'd imagine, right? Because you can't have like the CEO of like a Fortune 500 company openly like out there in the market interviewing, right? With a CV on Indeed, like, right? So
that would be something.
Yeah, exactly. That's the other side of recruitment that I don't generally have that much insight on. From the work that I do, yeah, winner's the one that gets paid. So I'll get paid a base salary, and then again, different companies can structure their commission differently. I think a lot of them do it quarterly. The two companies I've worked with do it quarterly. So every quarter you rack up like as much money, like revenue you can for the company. And then again, depends on how the company wants to structure it, but usually it's like a sliding scale. So kind of like how tax is done, essentially. So if you make £0 to £5 for the company, you get 10% of that.
Yeah.
If you make and then every bit between £5 and £20, you make 20%. And then £20 to £50, you make 25% or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so you have one quarter to try and build up as much as you can. And then at the new quarter, it restarts.
I realize, and this is just clicking for me in terms of the winner takes all aspect. Are multiple people on your team and at your company working on one client's like job request? So they're like, we have this role, we want to fill this role. And then you like, there's you and there's your colleague, and you're all working to find someone, and you all find different candidates and present them to the hiring manager at the company. And that's why the winner take all aspect exists.
It can be. I guess the two companies I've worked for are examples for how you can do it differently across companies. Depends which culture you go for, right? So my previous company, it was exactly that. Multiple people would be working the same job. So you're going up against your colleagues.
Wow.
Right. I think they actually, given the circumstances, managed the culture well, that there wasn't really any backstabbing. But you can imagine, and I imagine other companies, and it naturally just nature of it sets it up for backstabbing to happen. I mean, we're talking for a hire, if it's going to make you between £5,000 and £6,000 or something like that, pounds, it's like a fair amount of money. And if all you have to do is just like, if you're the more senior person, all you have to do is just tell the junior person that you sent their CV and you didn't actually, right? So it's only yours in play. Yeah, I'm sure that happens, right? I think it can be, quite brutal. And I think that's personally, I feel like that feeds in quite a lot to a lot of the culture that it had in London. Just really aggressive, really fast paced. Not all recruitment companies do it like that. To be really honest, like the one which I work for now, granted, we're a little bit smaller, I think, but they focus a bit more on specialization, as it were. So I essentially own everything within financial markets technology. So if there's a role that comes under kind of my remit, within reason, right? Obviously there's blurred lines and things like that all the time. But the idea being, if it's within my remit, that'll be the role that I work, and I don't have any internal competition, as it were. I think, I mean, I guess the downside of that is, from a company perspective, you've got one person working a role rather than 5.
Yeah.
Right. So it's relying a lot on the quality of the person that you have to deliver good candidates. Whereas in my previous company, the bar is raised because, one, you know that you're competing against 5 of your colleagues. Usually, well, it wouldn't be 5 of your colleagues, but like 1 or 2 of your colleagues, right? But from the company perspective, the CVs presented by the company are the best that they can get, right? I think the negative, or maybe the slightly downside of the way my company works now, is it does open the door for me being a bit more relaxed. I know I've not got any competition internally, so I could take my foot off the gas.
I feel like that would make an amazing TV show. I feel like, like Industry, the TV show Industry, about the like investment bankers in England. I feel like there could be one for recruitment. That would be wild. That like internal backstabbing. Damn. That. Anyway, new idea. I'm going to take that to my friends, make a lot of money off of you. I want to touch upon quickly what growth looks like in this field. I know you mentioned earlier that there are these research positions that you come out as a grad doing, but like, where do you go? Where do you grow? What is the ultimate goal for your industry?
That's a good question. I think the very natural progression, I guess, come in as a grad, for example, you do this research position where most of your role is focused on calling candidates and getting them through the process, right? As you get more and more experienced, you're able to handle more of the process, or you're trusted to handle more of the process, as it were. You can take the candidate all the way through to offer and be trusted to manage the whole process yourself. Yeah, further along, you'll probably be asked to do some more BD. So go and speaking to clients directly. More and more senior that you go, I imagine you get more access to account management. You're trusted to go speak to the client directly. I think after that, people become desk heads, division heads, regional country leads. I think as you go further and further up the food chain, people typically, again, kind of sweeping statement, depends on the company, but people typically become less hands-on from a day-to-day like recruitment perspective. It's rare that someone who's quite senior in their job will be speaking to candidates day in, day out, right at the start, or be on LinkedIn searching for people. Just, one, don't have the time, / two, they're probably more valuable in a different way. A lot of the time, they'll probably be negotiating terms with a client or managing client relationships, or maybe even if they are doing kind of the hands-on recruitment stuff, be working on the more senior hires. So working more on the director level stuff. I think the one thing I will say is it's hard for me to say comparing it to other industries, but I believe recruitment has quite a high attrition rate. I think a lot of people go in and do it for a few years. Like it's very, very heavily weighted towards younger people in their like, not even just 20s, I think like early 20s.
Interesting.
I think as you get, there's fewer and fewer people who you see have 10 plus years of recruitment experience, certainly within an agency. A lot of people go in-house, meaning that they go work for talent acquisition at the company. A lot of people go to technology sales, especially in my industry, like the tech sector, and that go work in technology sales. Some might go do business development for a company. Some might go down a bit more of an HR route. And then some people just leave the industry and kind of pivot and do something completely separate. Quite a few people set up their own firm as well. Like if like 5 to 10 years into your career, you've got quite a good brand name, you've got a good relationship with your clients, and you set up your own firm, all of a sudden you're not taking a percentage split, like commission wise, right? You're just getting the full fee. So for example, a pretty standard percentage fee agreed with like a bank, for example, let's say 20% to make it easy. If you place a candidate who's getting paid 100K base salary a year, the recruitment agency gets paid 20% of that. So 20K. And then, you know what I talked about earlier in terms of like stacking things up per quarter and then getting maybe 20%, 25, depending on the company's commission structure. All of a sudden you're not getting 4 or 5K or whatever it is, right? You're now getting 20K. So a lot of people set up their own firms, but it's obviously a very saturated market and it's not easy, right? But those who are good at what they do, and that's a route a lot of people go down.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Make a lot of money. When looking at your journey to this field, do you remember your first exposure to recruitment? Did you do any internships in this space?
No, not at all. I think it's, again, I don't know about Singapore. I haven't spoken to other people here. Certainly in London, almost everyone kind of falls into recruitment. I don't think this isn't like a slight on the industry or anything like that. Just like, I don't think there's that much exposure to it when you're younger. I don't think anyone like at 14, 15 thinks about like, oh, I really want to get into recruitment. I just don't think people are aware of it. Like, I didn't know what it was until I literally basically graduated uni. Yeah, you just fall into it. A lot of people just aren't really too sure what they want to do. And I know a lot of people in recruitment who are like, oh, I plan to do this for 2-3 years, like myself, right? Make a bit of money and then go do what I'm really passionate about, whatever that was. But if you are, a hardworking and you're fortunate enough to do well, it does pay really, really well. So it does kind of tie people in. But yeah, to answer your question, I don't necessarily think people really grow up wanting to be recruiters. I just don't think there's that much exposure to it, if I'm honest.
No, absolutely. I mean, like, I barely know about it because I'm in a field where I've never been approached by a recruiter. And so I would have no idea even now if I didn't have like the friends or you or things like that. Anyway, you studied law at university. Do you think that that has been useful in the work that you're doing now?
Honestly, no, not at all. The honest answer. Firstly, I could have probably worked harder at uni. So I'm not sure how much skill I picked up there. I don't know. I think probably at some point there's probably some aspect of being able to like create and rationalize arguments to some extent. I never did any of the mock trial stuff at uni that maybe would have been useful in terms of arguing and like conversation and negotiation. But law at uni for me was a whole lot of reading about cases, a whole lot of trying to, if I'm honest, trying to remember stuff for exams to try and pass. Right. It was really, really a lot about like memory and just trying to like take in as much as I could so I could just like word vomit onto a page in an exam, right? I would say like I do think that's why you get a really, really wide range of personalities in recruitment because you don't have the same background. There's massive amount of like diversity, certainly in terms of, I would say, socioeconomic backgrounds within recruitment. Not that much, I'd say, diversity in other areas where I could improve, like gender. Companies where I've worked at haven't been that like ethnically diverse, but certainly in terms of like upbringing, get a real like slate of characters because you don't just get loads of people who are, it's getting better, but you don't get a load of people who are just like privately educated, went to a Russell Group uni and all studied like law and all know each other. Yeah. Right. You just get some people went to uni, some people didn't. Those who went to uni, some went to really, really top universities. Some studied theatre, some studied theoretical physics. Wow. I think it's more about the one unifying personality is that typically people are quite money motivated. Like I would say it's rarer to see someone go from recruitment to work for an NGO, for example. I'd say that one kind of like overriding trait that you can see across the board because it is time consuming, it is quite stressful, but the big sell of the industry, as it were, is quick career progression and cash quite quickly.
Yeah. Well, it is almost time to wrap up, which is such a bummer because it's been so fun, but I do want to get a bit of advice from you. So I want to start with, what is the best career decision you think you've ever made?
I'll probably say moving to Singapore. I don't just necessarily say that for the difference in like geographical location, which in of itself has been great, but I think the value that you get from working in a different environment and working with new people and working for a new company is so much more than you would initially think or realize, which is funny because it's what I say to candidates all the time when I'm trying to convince them to move, right? So it's interesting that I didn't take my own advice for a little while, but the previous company I worked for was great. Like in terms of, it was hard, but they offered me like a good career progression track. I felt like emotionally tied in a good way to a lot of my colleagues. I bought into the brand really well. And so there was a part of me that was like, why would I need to move? And that's not to say to anyone who's, really happy where they are. I'm not saying that, you have to leave because sometimes you are in a really, really great situation and you shouldn't just throw it away. But for me personally, just seeing how different companies decide to operate. Like a really, really easy example is my previous company used to only really grow organically. So you only really hired grads basically. And my current company doesn't basically hire anyone with less than, I think it's 2 or 3 years experience already. And ideally more because you're only really interested in kind of plug and play type situation. So just kind of getting exposure to how different businesses run. The way that my boss works is very different to the way that my previous bosses worked. The way that some of my colleagues work, very, very different. A lot of my colleagues now are a bit older. A lot of them have got, partners, kids. That wasn't the case in my previous company. So just getting exposure to different things, I think is really, really valuable. Just broadens your perspective quite a lot.
Yeah. And then what would your advice be for someone who wants to get into your field?
the main bit of advice I would give is know what your motivations are for a job. I still feel there's a little bit of a stigma attached to being very, very money motivated, fairly or unfairly. I'm not here to debate that. It's just, I think that is a reality. I think if you can look yourself in the mirror and say that you are without being too ashamed about it, I think then it's a really, really good industry. I think I've personally always said, I always think the recruitment industry is a bit of a scam in the sense that I always felt like I got paid far more than I deserved for what I did. And I think that's the case of a lot of industries when you look at what, doctors and teachers get paid, obviously, but just even compared to other corporate jobs, just some of the hours that my friends were working. That's not to say that I didn't work hard, but I always felt it was almost kind of this gap in the market where I was like, I don't really understand how works to get paid, how a company gets paid 20% of the base salary just for finding someone who wants that job. It just always felt like a bit odd to me. But the job does come with a lot of emotional up and downs. But I'd say the kind of the main skill the two main skills that you have to have are resilience and just work ethic. Because the reason that you don't need an academic background is because it's not necessarily that academic or that intellectual a job compared to a lot out there. It's just not. It's a lot about, are you willing to work a bit harder than the next person next to you? Are you willing to not cut corners? And if you are and you care about career progression and you care about making a lot of money, then I think it's great for you. I think less so in Singapore, but certainly in London, I think there is still quite a big stigma's probably strong. I think there's still a bit of a view on where recruitment sits on the social prestige hierarchy, if you like. And if that is something that matters to you, just be honest with yourself. I think a lot of my friends, just from upbringing, a lot of my friends have gone into the management consultants, work in finance. A lot of them are working for these big brands, companies. A lot of them are doctors, a lot of them are lawyers. And there is an element of social prestige and how you're seen in the job that you do, right?
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily think recruitment sits that high. So if that is something that you care and value about, and each person's different, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but if that's something that you care and value about, just be aware of where recruitment sits there. That would be my advice. Just know what you're going into.
Yeah. That's really interesting that you say all of that. I mean, I feel like it is truly one of the hardest jobs. I feel like you are working so hard and you are doing it. It just seems so malleable and just unique. I just feel like it's interesting that you have that perspective, and I will have to have you back to dive into that a little bit deeper. Anyway, and then last piece of advice. What advice would you give to your younger self? And this may actually fall into what you've previously said, but what advice would you give your younger self when they were about to start your first job after university?
I think the advice I would give, if I knew I was already going into recruitment, would be appreciate when the market is hot. I think if you look at the state of like the finance market at the moment, very few places are hiring. A lot of banks are making redundancies. Elections globally just means that people are quite cautious, which means that there's just not that much work at the moment. A lot of companies are trying to survive. And I think when it was rife and everyone was hiring and everyone was making money, I almost wish I'd taken more advantage of that and worked even harder at that time, because it is so commission based. You end up making a lot of money when the market's good. Right? So I just wish I would have maybe appreciated that a bit more at the time and been not necessarily even just to have worked harder at that time. I don't even think that. It's just more like be a bit more conscious of the fact that, oh, wow, okay, this is like a really, really good time. It's not always going to be this good. Just like enjoy it while it's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like, how do you work harder than 12-hour days? I'm like, dude, you need to sleep at some point. That is wild.
Yeah, I think maybe the perspective I've got on it. My brother's a doctor.
Oh.
So just seeing like some of the hours and the shifts that he puts in, I'm just like, yeah, right, okay. I'm like complaining about a candidate not taking my job, and my brother's just come back and he's just like dealing with someone who like nearly died today. It's like, okay, cool, yeah, perspective for me, understood.
I mean, that's so funny. I complain about like an 8-hour day. I'm like, ugh, I can't take my nap in the middle of the day. What are you on about? So, geez. Anyway, I get it though. Okay. Finally, before we wrap this all up completely, but finally, I know you obviously just moved, but for you, Lewis, what's next?
Good question. I think for the next couple of years, just try and build my brand out in Singapore. Just try and do the best that I can. Yeah, I think like it's a new part of the world. I'm gonna try and travel here and there in places that I wouldn't otherwise. And then maybe in a couple of years, I'd quite like to probably work a different market. I think at that point I'd be fairly well-rounded, hopefully. Now, I'd worked in London, I'd worked in Singapore, and I'd covered the US, like East Coast market for a while. So yeah, somewhere else in the world probably be it. And then eventually I think I'd like to settle back home in London. Family are there, so that's probably what the long-term future holds.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to chat with me. I know it's now late in Singapore time, so I really appreciate it. And I really am grateful that you came on today.
That's right. Thank you very much for having me. It's good fun.
Yay, good. I'm glad. All right.